What is a true narco state? What is the real-life Breaking Bad? Mexico, simply by taking out a cartel kingpin, saw half the country set ablaze by traffickers in retaliation, plunging directly to the brink of a full-scale civil war. Here is how it happened. Right after the New Year, specifically on February 22nd, the Mexican military, heavily backed by U.S. intelligence, deployed its absolute elite forces in the Tapalpa region of Jalisco state. They launched a lightning-fast raid. They had only one target, the world's most wanted drug lord, the supreme leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel CJNG. This man was better known by his notorious alias, the 56-year-old Mencho. He was severely wounded in a fierce firefight and subsequently died while being emergency airlifted by a military helicopter to Mexico City. To take him down, the US government had previously laid down an astronomical $15 million bounty. This was the most earth-shattering anti-drug operation executed by the Mexican government since the capture of El Chapo Guzman. You think the big boss is dead, so the story ends here. Quite the opposite. Just hours after news of El Mencho's death broke, the true nightmare began. The CJNG did not collapse like a headless snake. Instead, like a beast whose nest had been kicked. They instantly launched a coordinated, frenzied retaliation across at least 21 states. Heavily armed hitmen drove armored vehicles onto the streets, torching buses, private cars, heavy trucks, and gas stations. They blockaded highways with machine guns. Street-side shops were set ablaze everywhere, thick smoke blotting out the sun. The militants even took the offensive, engaging Mexican security forces in pitched warfare across several locations. In just a few days, over 70 people were killed. Among them were 25 soldiers of the Mexican National Guard. Jalisco State bore the brunt of the assault. Puerto Vallarta and Guadalajara, international resorts usually swarming with tourists, were turned directly into war zones. This utterly terrified the Americans. Sunning themselves on the beaches, United Airlines, American Airlines, Aeromexico, and Air Canada completely suspended flights to affected regions. Thousands of US tourists were trapped in their hotels, listening to gunfire and explosions right outside their windows. The US State Department issued an overnight do not travel advisory, listing at least 5 states as high-risk zones. Mexico's new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, appealed for calm on national television. The security cabinet held emergency meetings, announcing that most roadblocks had been cleared, and the situation was stabilizing. But this narrative, let alone the international community, wasn't even believed by the Mexican public. What everyone truly fears is that, with the El Mencho dead, the massive power vacuum within the CJNG could ignite a much larger, all-out cartel war. This brings us to what exactly the CJNG is. What are they made of? How could they force a sovereign nation to such a breaking point? The last drug lord who dared to face a national army head-on was Colombia's Pablo Escobar. And that was back in the last century. But today's CJNG is entirely the product of lethal upgrades and iterations. They are not just one of Mexico's most violent cartels. They operate as a full-fledged paramilitary force. US-made heavy sniper rifles, shoulder-fired rocket launchers, modified mine-resistant armored vehicles, explosive-dropping drone swarms. They have it all. Their sphere of influence spans multiple Mexican states. Local governments and police systems are riddled with their infiltration. But the one thing about CJNG that makes Americans grind their teeth in hatred is fentanyl. On US streets, over 70,000 people die from fentanyl overdoses every year. This number far exceeds deaths from shootings and car crashes combined. It is undeniably the #1 killer of Americans by unnatural causes. And the CJNG is one of the largest pipelines smuggling fentanyl into the US. They source precursor chemicals from Asia, build super labs in the Mexican jungles, manufacture fentanyl pills on assembly lines, and use underground networks to pump them endlessly into every corner of America. So the question is, if CJNG is this formidable, why didn't the Mexican government move on them before? And why exactly now? This brings us to the true mastermind orchestrating this grand drama, the United States. If you trace the timeline, it all makes sense. January 2025, Trump returns to the White House. Right off the bat, he signs an executive order requiring a study to designate Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. On February 20th, CJNG and 7 other Latin American criminal syndicates were placed on the Foreign Terrorist Organization blacklist. This terrorist organization designation is not just a simple name change. Previously, this was considered anti-narcotics, handled by police and the DEA, focusing on arrests, evidence gathering, extradition, and legal procedures. Now it's called counterterrorism, and that falls under the jurisdiction of the US military and the CIA. The US can use military force for targeted assassinations, can freeze any bank accounts linked to these organizations, and can even sanction foreign government officials deemed ineffective in their crackdown. One word changed, and the rules of the game completely changed. Throughout 2025, Trump applied maximum pressure. He constantly bombarded Mexico on social media, threatening that if they didn't solve the fentanyl problem, he would impose devastating tariffs on all their exports. By November, he laid his cards on the table, stating publicly that, to protect American lives, he was prepared to launch military strikes against drug cartels inside Mexico. This truly sent Mexico into a panic. What does Mexico's economy rely on? Exports. Where does over 80% of those exports go? To the United States. If Trump actually wields the tariff stick, the Mexican economy would collapse in months. Not to mention, if the US military crosses the border directly under the guise of counterterrorism, Mexico's sovereignty becomes nothing but a piece of scrap paper. Therefore, the February 22nd raid wasn't something Mexico initiated willingly. They were forced into it. They had to deliver a high-profile target to temporarily appease the White House's fury. During the operation, US intelligence essentially spoon-fed them the details. Mencho's location, his escape routes, everything was calculated for them. The Mexican military simply had to execute the plan. As soon as the operation concluded, the White House immediately issued a statement praising the brilliant results. Secretary of State Marco Rubio even flew directly to Mexico City to announce, President Trump will wage war on the cartels. You see, this wasn't just an anti-drug victory. It was clearly an act of political submission. But the problem is, the price of this submission was too high. With Mencho dead, Pandora's box has been opened. Why do I say a civil war might erupt next? 3 reasons. First, the power vacuum. The underworld operates much like a feudal dynasty. The greatest fear is the old emperor dying abruptly without an heir. With Mencho dead, within the CJNG, those regional bosses who command their own forces, controlling various smuggling routes and armed factions, these various warlords, who will submit to whom, to seize supreme leadership, and to control the distribution of tens of billions of dollars in drug money annually. Internal violent conflict is an absolute certainty, and internal purges within a cartel are often far more brutal than fighting government troops. Second, external enemies circling. CJNG is not the only player in Mexico. Take the old guard, Sinaloa cartel, the syndicate once led by El Chapo Guzman. Although they've been overshadowed by CJNG in recent years, their strength remains intact. Now, seeing their old rival holding a funeral, leaderless, it would be strange if Sinaloa didn't exploit the chaos to strike. After Guzman was extradited to the US back then, Sinaloa fought an internal war for several years. Other gangs joined in to encircle them. Mexico's homicide rates skyrocketed. With Mencho's fall this time, it will only be worse. Third, and this is the most terrifying part, within hours of Mencho's death, CJNG launched coordinated armed actions simultaneously across 21 states. Think about what that implies. It proves they had contingency plans ready long ago. Their command system, communication networks, and grassroots execution are stronger than government forces in many parts of Mexico. And the supreme irony is, this cut of the head to collapse the organization logic has been tested countless times in Mexico. Every single time, the result is that, after cutting off the head, the situation only gets worse. Just look back at Mexico's drug war history, and you'll see. In 2006, then Mexican President Felipe Calderón declared an all-out war on the drug cartels, deploying the military onto the streets for massive sweeps. The US fully supported this from behind, providing intelligence, equipment, and training, pouring billions of dollars into it. And the result, during Calderón's 6-year term, the number of Mexicans killed by drug-related violence exceeded 120,000. He indeed took down several major drug lords. But for every one taken down, the original cartel would splinter into 3 or 4 smaller gangs. These smaller gangs fought bloody turf wars, causing the level of violence to multiply exponentially. The most classic example is El Chapo Guzmán. In 2016, Guzmán was captured for the 3rd time, extradited to the US in 2017. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years, locked away in a Colorado Supermax facility. He will never get out in this lifetime. Logically speaking, with the head of the Sinaloa cartel chopped off, this gang should be finished, right? The outcome was entirely the opposite. Once Guzmán was gone, a bloody civil war erupted between his sons and his old partner, El Mayo Zambada. The Sinaloa cartel fractured from a unified criminal empire into warring armed factions. Mexico's homicide rate surged by over 20%. In just 1 year, 20,000 people were murdered, and the power vacuum created by this internal war provided the opportunity for scene's frantic expansion. El Mencho seized the moment while Sinaloa was fighting itself, building CJNG into Mexico's largest drug cartel. Do you see the cycle here? The US helps Mexico take out Guzmán. After Guzmán falls, Sinaloa descends into civil war. The civil war gives CJNG the space to rise. Once CJNG grows dominant, it becomes the top US target. The US then forces Mexico to take out El Mencho. With El Mencho dead, CJNG will plunge into its own civil war, and that civil war will spawn the next, even more ruthless organization. This isn't solving the problem. This is a perpetual motion machine that generates problems. The US itself actually knows this pattern. People within the US Drug Enforcement Administration (DEA) have long pointed out that the Decapitation Strategy has failed in Mexico because demand in the drug market hasn't disappeared. The profits haven't disappeared. As long as the money is there will always be people willing to risk their lives to earn it. You cut down one crop, and the next crop grows wilder and more ruthless. The older generation of drug lords at least had some Underwood rules. They didn't touch civilians or bomb hospitals. But the new generation of young thugs coming up have absolutely no bottom line. They build their authority purely by manufacturing terror. So El Mencho's death for the CJNG might not be the end, but the beginning of a mutation. A unified criminal empire is terrifying, certainly, but a group of uncontrollable, independent, armed fragments competing over who is the most ruthless, that is a true living hell. So, if the situation in Mexico truly deteriorates entirely, who is the biggest winner? That would still be Trump. If you think carefully, it all becomes clear. First, politically, he won. Trump has always advocated a tough stance on Mexico, building walls, anti-immigration, fighting drugs. Previously, Democrats constantly mocked him as being all talk. And now, under his intense pressure, Mexico actually deployed troops and killed the world's top drug lord. This is a tangible political achievement that no one can erase. Second, he secured a strategic tool, designating the CJNG as a foreign terrorist organization. This move was brilliant. Before, the US had to find various excuses to meddle in Mexican internal affairs. Now, there is no need. You have terrorist organizations in your home. I have an obligation to fight terrorism, choking your economy, reaching my military into your house. It is all entirely legal and justified. But the most crucial is the third point. If Mexico truly descends into chaos, truly falls into a full-scale civil war, what will Trump do? He won't feel sorry. He will be happy. Just think about it. If American media broadcasts footage every day of gunfights at the Mexican border, burning cars, fleeing civilians, what will Trump say? He will stand at the podium and say, "See, I told you Mexico was a mess." They fundamentally cannot control the situation themselves. To protect the security of the US homeland, we must completely seal the border. We must station troops on the borderline. If necessary, we even have to send troops directly to help them wipe out these terrorists. Do you see it now? The more chaotic Mexico becomes, the stronger Trump's justification for pushing extreme border policies. If Mexico is peaceful and stable, what reason does he have to continue border segregation? What will he use to distract domestic attention only when the backyard is truly on fire? Does the persona of the fire chief hold up, even if this fire, in essence, is one he forced the Mexicans to light themselves? There is an old Mexican saying, "Poor Mexico." So far from God, so close to the United States. Looking at it today, every word cuts to the bone. American addicts consume the majority of the world's drugs annually, providing the cartels with tens of billions of dollars in profit. American arms dealers turn a blind eye to weapons smuggling, ensuring Mexican gangs are better equipped than the regular army. To put it bluntly, the drug empire entrenched in Mexico is a monster bred by America's own demand. Yet the chosen method to solve the problem is to hold Mexico by the nose and force strong medicine down its throat. If you strike the cartels retaliate, plunging the nation into devastation. If they don't strike back, the US brings down the hammer, and the economy collapses. This is Mexico's reality today. Caught between a superpower and criminal empires. It is a lose-lose situation. And what about Trump? Sitting in the Oval Office in Washington, watching Mexico engulfed in flames, likely with a Diet Coke close at hand. For him, this is all going exactly to plan. He demanded Mencho's head. He wanted the ensuing chaos in Mexico, and he certainly wants the subsequent border crisis. The death of one drug lord has handed him an impeccable deck of geopolitical cards. But there is one question Trump may not have seriously considered. When you turn your neighbor's yard into a war zone, can your own fences truly hold the line? Fentanyl precursor chemicals are still flooding into Mexico relentlessly. Addicts on American streets are still lining up for their fix. Kill one Mencho, and another will rise. Dismantle the CJNG, and a new acronym will take its place. As long as the US drug demand remains unsolved, as long as the profit chain connecting demand to supply exists, the fires in Mexico will never be extinguished, and a neighbor perpetually on fire. To the United States itself, is that ultimately an asset or a liability? This is an equation Trump likely hasn't factored in. On what grounds? Does Russia dare to stand against half the world? Russia's courage to draw its sword stems primarily from three pillars of strength. On March 29, 2004, NATO announced the results of its fifth wave of expansion, accepting the accession bids of 6 countries including Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Following NATO's public announcement, the Russian Foreign Ministry and the Kremlin both issued swift and fierce reactions in protest of this enlargement decision. However, facing Russia's intense backlash, Western nations remained indifferent. Almost no one anticipated that from this moment onward, Russia would gradually enter a state of direct confrontation with the West. From then on, Russia would single-handedly confront half the globe. Russia's first pillar of strength derives from the immense military legacy left by the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, the Soviet Red Army possessed a military apparatus fully capable of rivaling the United States. According to estimates by multiple Western media outlets, the Soviet nuclear arsenal once exceeded 11,000 warheads. And even after the Soviet collapse, the Russian nuclear arsenal still retained over 6,000 nuclear warheads. Furthermore, among these warheads, the majority are the vastly more destructive hydrogen bombs. Additionally, the massive military-industrial complex built during the Soviet era was inherited intact by Russia. With this formidable inheritance, Russia can not only continually develop new weapons, but also export domestically manufactured arms. To this day, regional powers like India and Egypt remain major clients of Russian arms enterprises. For many years, Russia's total arms sales have consistently stayed above $28 billion. While this scale of arms sales might not eclipse the global arms giant, the United States, it is entirely sufficient to assert Russia's status as a military superpower. On October 10, 2013, Russia launched a missile from the famous Decapitation missile launch site, an upgraded Topol intercontinental ballistic missile. As a result, this missile flawlessly struck a target located in Kazakhstan. It is safe to say, Russia once again demonstrated to the world, through sheer capability, its profound prowess in military-industrial R&D. Compared to smaller nations, splintered from the former USSR like Ukraine and Estonia, the Soviet legacy inherited by Russia was largely comprehensive and integrated, including Soviet-era institutions like the Tupolev Design Bureau and the Sukhoi Design Bureau, world-leading military research facilities, which were seamlessly absorbed by Russia. In 2009, Russia announced the development of the new Sarmat series of missiles. According to data released by the Russian government, the launch weight of this missile is significantly lower than the SS-18 missiles previously deployed by Russian forces. This signifies that Russia has steadily emerged from the chaos of the Soviet collapse, and all facets of its military technology are advancing methodically. A resurgent Russia undeniably strikes fear into Western nations. However, the Soviet era left Russia with far more than an astonishing stockpile of weaponry and terrifying R&D capabilities. What makes the Western world truly apprehensive about Russia is far more than just its military influence. Regarding post-Soviet Russia, someone once made a very vivid analogy. A Russia without the Soviet Union is like an oversized gas station, devoid of any real influence. While this quite certainly represents how a significant faction views Russia, it has also created a powerful illusion for many. Although Russia did indeed decline after the Soviet dissolution, this does not mean Russia is content with being relegated to a mere regional power. The formidable political influence inherited from the Soviet era is precisely Russia's second pillar of strength. In fact, after the Soviet collapse, Russia continued operating multiple military bases worldwide. These military bases remain the tentacles of Russia's expanding political influence, causing sleepless nights for Western governments. For instance, the naval base built by the Soviets at Cam Ranh in Vietnam was utilized by Russia all the way until 2003. Ultimately, under the pressure of domestic and diplomatic crises, Russia announced its withdrawal from Cam Ranh Bay. In 2011, Syria erupted into severe civil strife. US-backed opposition forces ignited conflicts across Syrian territory, thriving on the chaos. The Americans deliberately fueled this civil war in Syria, pushing Syrians to slaughter each other, not merely to seize Syria's oil resources. Because its president, Bashar al-Assad, is a deeply pro-Russian political figure. Therefore, the Americans had to pay any price to unseat him from the presidency. To preserve its influence in the Middle East, Russia did not hesitate to directly dispatch pilots and volunteers into Syrian territory to fight alongside the Syrian government. After a grueling 8-year war, just as Syrian anti-government forces had nearly reached the Syrian capital of Damascus, the Syrian government army, with Russia's backing, tenaciously pushed the rebels back. Today, although the conflict in Syria continues, Russia's political influence in Syria, and by extension the broader Middle East, has been tenuously preserved. This demonstrates that the American attempt to squeeze Russia's geopolitical breathing room is by no means an easy feat. Beyond the Middle East and Southeast Asia, Russia also maintains massive political sway in Africa, including West African nations like Niger and Nigeria, which have historically hosted pro-Soviet armed groups or regimes. To sustain Russian influence in these regions, the Russian government has even deployed mercenaries to operate across West and Central Africa. These highly capable mercenary forces can bypass normal protocols to overtly subvert a nation's regime. Currently, they have already established a massive zone of control within the African interior. For many years, core members of the Western world like the US and France have attempted to classify these Russian mercenaries entrenched in Africa into lists of terrorist organizations. However, these efforts have all been met with fierce Russian resistance, leaving them consistently unfulfilled. Of course, beyond these numerous objective factors, the Russians have also absorbed profound historical lessons, leading the vast majority of the Russian populace today to abandon any notion of compromising with the Western world. Because, historically, Russia did experience a period of immense intimacy with the West. But this is precisely the era countless Russians are most reluctant to mention, because it was, frankly, an era of utter darkness. In 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia ushered in a thoroughly pro-American era. Because Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin, was a die-hard liberal. Under his leadership, Russia virtually became America's sidekick. Economically, Russia underwent unprecedented market-oriented reforms. Virtually overnight, the value of the ruble plummeted continuously. The life savings of countless ordinary Russians evaporated instantly within this sweeping tide of economic overhaul. Subsequently, numerous American corporations sequentially entered Russian territory, aggressively acquiring state-owned enterprises and factories left by the Soviet era. The most valuable assets across all of Russia were practically bought out by Americans and Western capitalists. Looking at their shattered nation, many Russians suddenly realized they had been utterly deceived by the previous liberal politicians. The West and America will never allow Russia the opportunity to be truly strong. As Yeltsin passed the presidential seat to Vladimir Putin, Russia's foreign policy began steadily pivoting towards the East. Although the Putin administration once attempted to maintain relatively amicable relations with the West, the Western Bloc ignored Russia's objections and absorbed Poland, Lithuania, and other Eastern European nations into NATO's sphere of influence. Consequently, beginning in 2004, the geopolitical chess match between Russia and the West intensified drastically. Despite the US aligning with its Western allies to impose the strictest economic sanctions on Russia, Russia actually matured amidst these Western sanctions and successfully broke free from its economic reliance on Western nations. Because as Western countries ramped up sanctions against Russia, Russia swiftly gravitated towards China in the East. China and Russia not only established dedicated corridors for grain trade, but even initiated multiple collaborations in the military domain. Early this century, Russia joined the China-led Shanghai Cooperation Organization (SCO). Subsequently, Russia, alongside China, India, and Brazil, spearheaded the formation of the BRICS organization. Through these maneuvers, Russia's influence was not weakened by Western suppression. Rather, it grew increasingly formidable. Moving past 2012, driven by the Snowden incident and the Crimean referendum, among other factors, the geopolitical environment facing Russia began sprinting toward a severe deterioration. By this point, Russia was essentially making an enemy of half the world. But confronting this reality, the Russian people show no panic. Although making an enemy of the Western world will inevitably bear economic consequences, the vast majority of Russians continue to back President Putin's decisions. Perhaps in future international political maneuverings, Russia and the Western Bloc will engage in even fiercer confrontations. But the Russian people will certainly not easily yield to their adversaries. This is not merely about the dignity of the Russian nation. It concerns the very survival of millions of Russian citizens. The lessons of history have already stripped Russians of their trust in the Western Bloc. Tested and tempered by time, they undoubtedly recognize now who Russia's true friends are. In 1911, Outer Mongolia, with the backing of Tsarist Russia, seized the opportunity amidst the raging revolution within China to opportunistically declare independence. In 1946, Outer Mongolia officially separated from China. Mongolia gained Chinese recognition. 1.56 million square kilometers of prime territory was permanently carved out of China's map. For decades thereafter, Outer Mongolia became an eternal pain in the hearts of the Chinese people. The thought of recovering Outer Mongolia has never been erased from Chinese minds. In the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and deteriorating Russian-Mongolian relations, China finally saw a prime opportunity to recover Outer Mongolia. Yet, facing this golden opportunity, China made no move to reclaim it. What was the reasoning behind this? Outer Mongolia was originally an inherent part of Chinese territory. In the 13th century AD, Genghis Khan united the regions north and south of the Gobi Desert, establishing the unified Mongol Khanate. When the Yuan dynasty was established in 1279, the Mongolian region fell under the jurisdiction of the Lingbei province. By the late 17th century, all of Mongolia submitted to the Qing dynasty. Therefore, since at least the 13th century, Mongolia had been a part of China's Central Plains dynasties. However, with the decline of the modern Qing dynasty, the already remote Mongolian region, facing weakening central authority, gradually embarked on a path toward independence. In the early 20th century, Tsarist Russia set its expansionist sights on Chinese Mongolia. Simultaneously, China was undergoing massive internal upheaval. The wave of the Xinhai Revolution swept across the nation. Provinces successively declared independence, and Mongolia was no exception, according to available historical records. Even on the eve of the Xinhai Revolution, Outer Mongolian princes and aristocrats hoped to leverage Tsarist Russian power to break away from China. However, they were rejected by the Tsarist government. The reason was that, at the time, Tsarist Russia lacked sufficient strength to support Outer Mongolian independence. When the Xinhai Revolution erupted, Outer Mongolia capitalized on the domestic political vacuum and publicly declared its secession from the Chinese map on December 28, 1911. The decision of the Outer Mongolian nobility exceeded Tsarist Russia's expectations to some extent, because right before Outer Mongolia's independence, the Russian foreign minister was still coordinating with Beijing. By this point, after years of cultivating influence and providing various forms of aid to Outer Mongolia, Russia had practically become its de facto protectorate. The Russian intention was to mediate a Sino-Mongolian treaty to guarantee Mongolia's autonomy. The Tsarist government's objective was to make China pledge not to station troops in Mongolia, not to migrate citizens there, and not to establish government institutions in Mongolia. During this period, Russia's goal was still solely to secure autonomy for Outer Mongolia, not demanding full secession and independence from China. Unexpectedly, the Outer Mongolian nobility went much further. They believed acknowledging China's suzerainty would be detrimental to Outer Mongolia, and thus flatly rejected Russia's autonomy proposal, opting to declare direct independence on November 3, 1912. Tsarist Russia had no choice but to sign the Russo-Mongolian Agreement. Mongolia's unilateral declaration of independence naturally lacked China's recognition. The Russo-Mongolian Agreement was also subsequently unrecognized by the Chinese side. In 1919, with the arrival of the October Revolution, a Russia overwhelmed by its own crises could no longer maintain control over Mongolia, having lost Tsarist Russian backing, facing severe development setbacks, and fraught with internal contradictions. Outer Mongolia's rulers briefly entertained the idea of returning to China. On November 18th, the Outer Mongolian nobility chose to submit to the Beiyang government, expressing willingness to return their autonomy to the central government. The Sino-Russian-Mongolian Agreement was subsequently annulled, but shortly after, with the establishment of the Soviet regime, this emerging power once again displayed intense interest in Outer Mongolia. On August 3, 1919, the Soviet government issued a manifesto stating, "The 1913 agreement is void. Mongolia has become an independent state." Simultaneously, Soviet Russia demanded Outer Mongolia swiftly establish diplomatic ties. This manifesto, forcefully mandating diplomatic relations, was a clear violation of international norms. At the same time, Soviet Russia prepared to channel the red tide of revolution into Outer Mongolia. In 1921, with Soviet assistance, the Mongolian People's Party established a people's government, announcing its independence from China to the world. After the founding of the PRC, China, the USSR, and Mongolia held multiple rounds of talks in Moscow. Finally, on February 14, 1950, a series of treaties were signed, including diplomatic notes respecting the independence of Outer Mongolia. Only then did China, under immense pressure, recognize Outer Mongolia's independence. However, for over half a century, China had never completely abandoned the idea of recovering Outer Mongolia, and the collapse of the Soviet bloc in the 1990s was the absolute best geopolitical opening to do so. During the Cold War in the 1950s, the newly established Mongolian Republic firmly aligned with the Soviet bloc. Its foreign policy was entirely dictated by the USSR's overarching strategy. Its national security interests were completely tethered to the Soviet Union. Some even referred to Mongolia as the 16th Republic of the Soviet Union. During this era, Mongolia's development relied entirely on Soviet backing. In the decades that followed, the Soviet Union poured approximately 20 billion rubles of aid into Mongolia, helping it build a modern state apparatus and a national economic system. In return, Mongolia made a fully committed pivot toward the Soviet Union, as one Mongolian prime minister stated. For Mongolia, 95% of the rest of the world simply did not exist at the time. However, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the 90s, everything changed. Russia, inheriting the Soviet legacy, did not maintain this intimate relationship with Mongolia. After the Soviet collapse, Mongolia's diplomatic status for Russia plummeted. Russia initiated a strategic retreat from Mongolia, terminating all forms of assistance, and completed its troop withdrawal by 1992. This dramatic policy reversal caused a comprehensive regression in Russo-Mongolian relations. Entering a state of stagnation, Mongolia faced immense vulnerability brought about by the shifting global order. Marking this as a turning point, the 70-year Russo-Mongolian alliance was officially shattered. Mongolia lost its economic, political, and military crutch overnight. From 1990 to 1994, Mongolia's GDP contracted by an average of 7.9% annually. GDP per capita plummeted from $1,340 to a mere $130. The entire nation experienced political turmoil, economic collapse, and social chaos. Under these dire circumstances, Mongolia was forced to pivot its foreign policy strategy. Sino-Mongolian relations subsequently entered a honeymoon period. China and Mongolia established diplomatic ties in 1949, but relations remained lukewarm during the Cold War. It wasn't until the late 80s that Sino-Mongolian relations saw substantial progress. In 1989, relations were formally normalized. Economic cooperation, in particular, became the primary catalyst, rapidly heating up the bilateral bond. In 1991, an agreement was reached allowing Tianjin port to serve as Mongolia's international shipping gateway. China slashed border trade tax rates by 50% and streamlined customs procedures for personnel and cargo transit. Bilateral trade volume skyrocketed, reaching $184 million in 1992. a 15-fold increase from 5 years prior. While Russo-Mongolian relations entered a deep freeze, Sino-Mongolian friendship was rapidly flourishing. This led to widespread rumors and speculation that China could seize this opportunity to reclaim Outer Mongolia, but grounded in geopolitical reality, this was clearly highly improbable, because the prerequisite for this warm Sino-Mongolian relationship was built entirely upon mutual respect and mutual support, as explicitly outlined in the Sino-Mongolian Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation signed in January 1993. Both nations declared themselves friendly states, pledging to respect each other's sovereignty and independence, to respect territorial integrity, to maintain absolute equality, the borders are sacred and inviolable, and to adhere to non-interference in internal affairs. It is evident that during this period, China had firmly recognized Mongolia's status as a sovereign state. The series of bilateral treaties were built on this exact foundation. One could say, the better Sino-Mongolian relations were during this time, the more solidified Mongolia's sovereign status became. It became increasingly impossible for China to tear up treaties and brazenly use military force to recover Mongolia. Moreover, although Russo-Mongolian relations had cooled, Moscow would never sit idly by and let China recover Mongolia, simply because Outer Mongolia's geopolitical position is far too critical. An American geopolitical strategist once proclaimed, "The remnants of Eurasia are the world's strategic pivot points. Whoever can control this area can go on to control the destiny of the entire Eurasian continent." And a nation like Mongolia, situated in the very heart of Eurasia, possessing such immense strategic value, is destined to become a central focal point in the chess match of global powers. From a geographical perspective, Mongolia is wedged directly between China and Russia, located inland in Northeast Asia, with a landmass of 1.56 million square kilometers. It is the quintessential landlocked state. Observers often vividly describe Outer Mongolia as a crucial buffer zone between China and Russia. From China's perspective, the Sino-Mongolian border stretches 4,677 kilometers. It shares intricate, inextricably linked ties with China, across territorial, historical, and cultural dimensions. Therefore, Mongolia's foreign policy undeniably impacts China's own security and stability. And from Russia's perspective, Mongolia's importance is equally self-evident. Historically, Russia has continuously coveted Mongolia's geographic positioning. For over 300 years since the early 17th century, Tsarist Russia used military incursions and diplomatic blackmail to persistently encroach upon Outer Mongolian privileges. During the Soviet era, it pulled Mongolia entirely into its sphere of influence, specifically to facilitate its strategic pursuit of sea access. Beyond that, Mongolia is a vital safeguard for Russia's territorial security. Russia's Asian territory is vast and sparsely populated, yet crucial industrial hubs and the Trans-Siberian Railway are concentrated along the border regions. China, Japan, and Mongolia are Russia's primary neighbors in Asia. The border between Mongolia and Russia stretches 3,000 kilometers. A massive but militarily weak Mongolia serves as a natural shield for Russia against perceived threats from China and Japan. Sandwiched between China and Russia, Mongolia is truly the strategic buffer zone and intersection of interests for both nations. Whether in the geopolitical or military domain, Mongolia holds a decisively critical position for both Beijing and Moscow. Therefore, Russia would absolutely never sit by and watch China absorb Mongolia. Taking this into consideration, China had no choice but to forego the geopolitical window created by the Soviet collapse and deteriorating Russo-Mongolian relations. Furthermore, beyond Russia, if China attempted to recover Mongolia by force, it would inevitably face fierce obstruction from the US, Japan, and others. Since the end of the Cold War, Mongolia initiated its third neighbor foreign policy, meaning, while navigating between China and Russia, it actively seeks to establish third neighbor relations with the US, India, Japan, and other nations in order to construct a diversified diplomatic network. Against this backdrop, if China ever chose to reclaim Mongolia, it would inevitably trigger a massive chain reaction, drawing immediate intervention from the US and the Western world. The ultimate outcome would likely be failure. Since its independence in the early 20th century, Outer Mongolia has been separated from China for over a century. Looking back over this 100-year history, the collapse of the Soviet Union was indeed the best opportunity for its recovery. Unfortunately, constrained by the international situation. However, constrained by the international situation and the diplomatic maneuvering between China, Russia, and Mongolia, recovering Outer Mongolia is by no means an overnight task. As for whether Outer Mongolia will return to the motherland in the future, no definitive conclusion can be drawn at this time. if Mongolia announces it's joining NATO? Will it suffer the same fate as Ukraine? Regarding this question, looking at the objective reality, if that day truly comes, its fate would likely be far worse than Ukraine's. Why is that? First, Mongolia is a textbook small nation. Calling it small is a comprehensive conclusion, drawn from multiple dimensions. After all, based solely on landmass, Mongolia, with its 1.56 million square kilometers, is not small. It's roughly 1/6 the size of China, making it the world's second largest landlocked country. So why refer to it as a small state? Because Outer Mongolia has lost any possibility of rising again to become a global power. The Unconference on Trade and Development conducted standardized economic evaluations and statistical analyses of nations worldwide. Based on this data, they compiled the least developed countries list, and Mongolia is prominently on it. In 2021, Mongolia's annual GDP was a mere $15.1 billion, lower than that of a single prefecture-level city in China's Inner Mongolia. Consequently, Mongolia is often mocked internationally as one of the poorest countries in the world. Poverty has become a deep-seated anxiety for the nation. However, despite being poor, Mongolia's resource reserves are anything but barren. On the contrary, they are vast. The country possesses extensive mineral wealth, both diverse in type and massive in volume. Take common coal resources, for example. Proven reserves stand at a staggering 160 billion tons. While it can't be compared to China, it ranks among the top in all of Asia. Furthermore, it is rich in gold, silver, copper, and iron ore deposits. The proven iron ore reserves alone total 2 billion tons, towering over the rest of Asia. It also holds significant reserves of phosphate rock, crude oil, and rare earth metals. The sheer volume is undeniable. It is truly blessed by nature. However, hampered by technological limitations, outdated equipment, and inadequate infrastructure for mining production, storage, and transportation, Mongolia's mining development capacity remains low. Productivity is dismal. This explains why Mongolia sits on a mountain of gold yet remains impoverished. Moreover, Mongolia is a quintessential landlocked state, deep inland, lacking any coastline. It naturally possesses no seaports. In today's interconnected world, if any nation wishes to empower itself or elevate its international standing, external communication, exchange, and international dialogue are essential. As a country without even a single port of exit, it is incredibly difficult for Mongolia to build foreign trade relations, let alone expand its global footprint. The inherent limitations of its geography seem to dictate that Mongolia must settle for being an isolated, landlocked country holding its corner of the map. In fact, in the year since its founding, Mongolia's guiding diplomatic principle has been to remain peacefully in its corner and befriend its neighbors. And as Mongolia's only two contiguous neighbors, China and Russia, our diplomatic counterparts Mongolia cannot avoid. After all, whether building outbound highways or establishing international flight routes, Mongolia must traverse the territory and airspace of China and Russia. Maintaining good relations is an absolute necessity. But Mongolia is not content with this, attempting to break free from its reliance on China and Russia, and seeking a new pillar of support further afield. And the new pillar Mongolia has set its sights on is none other than the United States. Separated from Mongolia by vast oceans and thousands of miles. So, is the US an easy pillar to cling to? With the upheavals in Eastern Europe and the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1990s, the Cold War subsequently ended. The United States emerged as the de facto victor of the Cold War and the world's sole superpower. No longer under Soviet control, Mongolia developed the desire to pivot toward the West. This diplomatic concept of breaking geographical constraints was dubbed by Mongolia as the third neighbor foreign policy strategy. Simply put, Mongolia wants to build bridges with a third neighbor outside of China and Russia, to form alliances to counterbalance power, leveraging alliances to solidify diplomatic ties, ensuring a force multiplier effect, to enhance its domestic political strength, thereby gaining leverage on the international stage. Based on this concept, Mongolia began seeking dialogue with Western nations, striving to establish a non-contiguous, extra-regional neighborly relationship. In recent years, There have even been rumors that Mongolia might seek to join NATO, sparking significant anxiety among its immediate neighbors. The truth is, the third neighbor Mongolia initially sought was actually Western European countries and the EU. However, as we established earlier, Mongolia's geographical position is highly awkward. Not only is it far from Europe, but it is entirely sandwiched between Russia and China. Whether geographically or politically, it is extremely difficult to forge connections with Europe. If China and Russia do not agree to Mongolia joining the EU or contacting Europe, then Mongolia couldn't even submit a written application or dispatch diplomatic envoys. Because with a single decree from China and Russia to seal the borders and close the airspace, Mongolia would face the dire predicament of having its planes grounded and its vehicles trapped. Therefore, the EU is not particularly keen on Mongolia's overtures. Furthermore, Mongolia during this period, aside from its poor geographical location, was economically underdeveloped, and its resources were not effectively exploited. It possessed absolutely no advantages to attract Europe. Realizing that entering Europe was a lost cause, Mongolia then pivoted its focus toward the United States and NATO. Not only did its domestic media make overtures to the US, but the government also actively engaged in dialogue with America, expressing from various angles its desire to cooperate with Western nations led by the United States. So what was the US attitude? It was more than happy to play the role of Mongolia's third neighbor, whether it's the US or NATO. Their evaluation of an ally isn't solely based on a display of loyalty. They don't gladly accept you just because of enthusiastic allegiance. They evaluate whether an ally brings tangible value. And while Mongolia lacks funds, lacks resources, and possesses a military barely capable of self-defense, it holds massive strategic value in the geopolitical chess game. Forging a strategic partnership with Mongolia not only allows for the containment of China and Russia, but also links America's strategic layouts in East Asia and Central Asia, creating a comprehensive encirclement of China. Naturally, the United States is willing. As for the scenario where Mongolia tries to join NATO, and how its fate would compare to Ukraine's, I suspect both China and Russia would quickly teach it a harsh lesson. If Mongolia were to announce it is joining NATO, would it end up like Ukraine? The harsh reality is, if Mongolia follows down Ukraine's path, it could be significantly worse. Although Ukraine has declined, it was, after all, once a republic of the Soviet Union. Following the Soviet collapse, Ukraine inherited a portion of the Soviet military legacy. While its military strength cannot compare to behemoths like China and Russia, in the Central and Eastern European region, it was considered a formidable force. Fully formed armored divisions, aircraft, artillery, and aging naval vessels. It might fall short of the best, but it was better than the rest. It is far beyond anything the Mongolian military could compare to. If we say Ukraine could put up a fight for a little while, then Mongolia might not even hold out for half a day. Furthermore, Russia has always viewed Mongolia as its own backyard. Mongolia's terrain is mostly flat, lacking sufficient strategic depth. Given the mechanized warfare capabilities of the Russian military, reaching Ulaanbaatar in half a day is not a difficult task. If Mongolia were to genuinely announce it is joining NATO, that would be an open declaration of hostility. China would certainly not stand idly by. Mongolia not only shares a border with China, but is practically situated right in the middle of China's map, and functions as the ultimate strategic buffer zone between China and Russia. If NATO extends its reach into this territory, it would be disastrously detrimental to China's national defense and security, because it concerns China's vital interests. China would certainly not immediately deploy a massive invasion force. However, mobilizing troops northward, maintaining a DEFCON 1 state of readiness, and applying intense military deterrence is a certainty. Unlike Ukraine, Mongolia does not have seaports to receive Western military aid. At that point, Mongolia would find itself without any real support, simultaneously facing a pincer attack from both Russia and China. Just ask yourself, given Mongolia's weakness, how could it possibly resist? And the story doesn't end there. From then on, Mongolia's credibility in the diplomatic ledgers of China and Russia would plummet. Its position on the international stage would become even more agonizing. Therefore, Mongolia should stop being capricious about this matter. An ancient Chinese proverb says, ruling a large country is like cooking a small fish. It means governing a massive nation is like frying a small fish. It requires mastering the heat, and more importantly, patience. Actually, although the outside world often mocks Mongolia as holding a golden bowl while begging, given Mongolia's abundance of resources. Relying on resource extraction and smelting industries to usher in an era of explosive economic growth is not entirely unforeseeable. Historically, China relied on its close relationship with the Soviet Union to introduce advanced Soviet technology. Later, through arduous independent research, it built the powerful China we see today. What Mongolia currently lacks is simply an opportunity, and Mongolia can fight for this opportunity itself, striving for cooperation with China and Russia to drive its own development. After all, both China and Russia are friendly nations that advocate equal diplomacy. They would never be stingy over trivial benefits and abandon a neighbor. There is an old Chinese saying, a close neighbor is better than a distant relative. Mongolia's obsession with a third neighbor is an illusion it is time to let go of.